Yeah, welcome everybody to the Church of Monica. Whoever doesn't know us or is new to Open Source Gallery, we are a small space and organization in Brooklyn, New York. It's usually the Church of Monica is usually happen in the space, but now virtually, which means that we can actually host a whole lot more people because our space is really tiny. So we'll hopefully continue having also virtual events, and hope you can join our mailing list if you are new to us and yeah, experience more of this. So today I want to welcome Neil Katz. I'm very honored to have him here today, and he is. Hold on, I have actually some notes. Yeah, so Neil Katz will present how origami structures can be scaled to be useful in architecture. He's an associate director at the architecture firm SOM. I actually have seen just a snippet of his talk a few months ago and was very fascinated on how he related and how he was talking about the artists who used origami and also how he uses it for his own structures and he uses it in architecture. So I'm really happy to have him here, and I just want to give him the word. So please Neil, take it from here.
Thank you very much, Monica, and thanks for inviting me. And also a shout out to Jesse, who I guess introduced us. So appreciate that as well. I'm going to talk about origami and architecture, two topics that fascinate me. I'm an architect by training, and very interested as part of architecture, combining math and art. That's what initially brought me in. And origami also is a combination of those two fields. And it's also very accessible. Origami is a very accessible art or craft. So you can easily get origami paper. They come in usually these little squares, 6 inches, 12 inches, and create these cranes. And there are instructions on the internet. You can buy a book. There's also a subfield of origami called modular origami. And in addition to these creatures, birds and insects, you can also create these geometric forms. And you don't even need origami paper. You can actually use any paper. So even a Post-it note will do, and able to create similar structures. So these are examples also of modular origami. And believe it or not, even material like plywood, usually origami works best when you use a very flexible material. But there are structures that you can create, and people that specialize in designing origami structures using rigid material. So can create larger scale structures, and I'll show some more examples of these as well. Some definitions, I won't read these, but in general, origami, it's an art coming from the Japanese culture. The word means folding and paper, and there are strict rules if you follow the practice rigorously, where you always start with a square piece of paper, and the only action that's allowed is folding and unfolding, right? Nothing else. There's a variation of origami called kirigami, and kirigami allows cutting the paper. So that increases the forms that you're able to create. And I'm going to talk about some of these people. I've listed masters in the field of origami as it relates to architecture. So these are not just origamists, right? There are additional people that focus on origami, but these people are origamists who also relate their work to architecture, to larger scale. About 6 years ago, I was invited to participate in a workshop at the University of Illinois, and it was focused on origami and engineering, and it was organized by Professor Paulino. And he invited many of the people in the list that we just saw, many of these masters in origami. But in addition to focusing on architecture and engineering, this conference was interdisciplinary. So had people working in origami in many different fields. Robert Lang is a very well-known origamist in the United States, probably the best known. And he actually studied physics. He's a physicist by training. And he decided to switch careers and become a full-time origamist. And much of his work is art related. So he created all these creatures that you see at the top. But also doing a lot of modular origami. He created the two images on the lower right, the polyhedra, and also the flag. And in the upper right, you can see him actually folding the flag. Because his background is physics, he's very interested in the science behind origami, and has written many papers and even books about the math background, the math relationship in origami, and how to sort of compute these folds that many artists just do intuitively. But there's a very rigorous math and science behind it, which he explores and writes about. So at this conference, there were also people that worked on origami at a very small scale. So folding molecules. So this paper, this presentation was about DNA, folding DNA. And another paper that focused on nanomaterials. So also folding things at a very tiny scale. And sort of a more human scale, Toma Hiratachi is a Japanese architect and teacher. And two things about Toma Hiratachi. One of his theses is that any form can be unfolded and then folded up again using origami techniques and strict origami techniques, right? No cutting, only folding. And one of his classic examples is the bunny rabbit on the upper left. And another one of his contributions to the field is something called rigid origami, where instead of using paper, which is very flexible material, he creates origami that uses plywood, right? A very solid material that's not flexible, that doesn't bend, but still able to create these structures because of the way that the joints and the structures are designed that move. So the shot on the right is actually a clip of an animation where he's opening and closing that wall. Now there's a sort of contradiction because origami is very flexible. Usually you can manipulate it. If it's one of these geometric pieces, you can fold and unfold it. But the material that he uses is very rigid. So it's the opposite of flexible, but he's able to do both with the technique that he developed. Another master in the field is Koryo Miura, who invented the fold that you see on the screen. And it's been used in maps. He worked for NASA for a while, or collaborated with NASA on using this fold for space-related work. And one of his influences was another scientist, Yoshimura, who created the folds that you see at the bottom. And those were inspired by taking a tin can, right, like a soda can, and crushing it, and then studying the patterns of the buckling when you crush the can. So just some various images that were shown by people who presented at this conference that show how origami is used at many different scales. So from a macro scale, creating forms that can be put in a rocket ship and then deployed or unfolded when they get to outer space to act as satellite dishes, satellite antennas, or solar collectors. And on the right side, very tiny structures that are origami based. In the upper right, with the blue background, are stents that are used inside of the body. So they're able to fold these devices that can flow through the body, move into a vein where there's maybe an obstruction, and then be able to expand when they get there to relieve that obstruction. Ron Resch, so now I'm going to talk about a few people who are not at this conference, other people who should have been there, but for one reason or another, in this case, because he passed away before the conference, were not able to attend. But their work is still amazing and worth considering when we talk about origami, and especially origami in architecture and at an architectural scale. His contributions are twofold. One of them is in the field of computational origami. And you know, when we think of computational, we usually think of computers. And in this case, I don't mean that specifically. I consider myself a computational designer, which more describes the process of design than the tools that I use to do it. I do use computers, but computational design is focused more on mathematics and geometry and looking at things such as nature and physics in the process of creating the designs that we create. And similar with origami, looking at nature, looking at mathematics, looking at physics. And Ron Resch also considered origami at an architectural scale. So very large scale structures. You can see the one that he has in front of him on his desk is a very large structure. And we'll see a few of his slides. He has a film called a paper and stick thing film that he actually presented as his thesis at the University of Utah in the 1970s. And he started out by crumpling a piece of paper and then unfolding it and looking for geometry in the folds that were created. And he actually found, found quite a bit of it. Almost like taking the can and crushing it and then looking for the buckling patterns. He did the same thing with a simple sheet of paper. And using his research, was able to create these forms, which are considered, he considered at an architectural scale. So these used curved folds. That's another interesting thing about his work and about the work of many others. Usually when you fold a piece of paper, you get a straight line as the fold. But there's also a field of origami that studies curved folding, and he was involved in that as well. And you can see on the bottom right, there are these two human figures. So how he perceived these as architectural. Similar here, you could think of these as buildings, right? And made from just pieces of paper. Or building components. So here we have, say, a window screen, right? Made of origami pieces. And some more of his work. He also explored different materials. So this is like a sheet of metal. So it's semi-rigid, all right? A thin sheet of metal is somewhat flexible, but to be used in architecture, you probably need something stronger than paper. And here's one of his large-scale pieces, right? Immense. So, you know, in traditional origami, many people create creatures like insects or birds, and you can see some typical birds, like the swan at the bottom. He also created birds, but in a slightly different way. So his birds are at the top, the two images at the top, and actually wrote about how he created them. So they're more abstract, and the folding patterns are very simple. And another one of his sculptures are these kissing cones. And, you know, I was lucky enough to have collaborated with Ron Resch when he was still alive. And this is one project that we worked on. So this particular sculpture was done many years ago, but he wanted to come back to it and explore variations of these kissing cones. So we created a computer model of the system where we start with a cone and then create a plane. And then where the plane slices the cone, we can bend it, we can fold it. And these are some variations to create, at the upper right, a simple cone related to the kissing cone. Now, it's not exactly the kissing cone because this cone is vertical. But if we tilt the cone, then we can see how it can relate to the kissing cone. And if we put two of those together, we can create the sculpture. Now, it wasn't enough, of course, just to recreate what he had already done, but we were looking at different variations. So one variation might be to tilt the plane where it's folding. And of course, it creates a fold and a structure that's not possible because it intersects itself. But there are many variations. And in this case, we're looking at multiple planes at different angles that are possible. Another one of his pieces. Now, these are all using the same fold, and he called this the water bomb fold. And these were created by hand. These are made out of paper. And this is the folding pattern. So it's a very simple folding pattern, and it's able to create these complex forms. Now, folding patterns are a little bit interesting. Usually, if you have a pattern like this one, or one that you can find on the internet to create a crane or an insect, there are two types of folds. There's one fold that's called a mountain fold, and that folds towards you, and that's represented in this diagram by the solid lines. And then there's another type of fold called a valley fold, and those folds fold away from you. So one folds sort of out of the paper, the other one folds into the paper. So you could see those two types, and that's all there are. That's all you could do. There are only two types of folds. And just those simple operations and this simple diagram is able to create these. I was teaching a class several years ago as I was collaborating with Ron Resch, and one student, so I gave them projects to do, and it was very flexible. They got to choose their own projects. And one student was interested in the work that Ron Resch was doing. So he chose this form as his project. So he created a model using a computer program called CATIA to create this model, which actually moves. I wish I had an animation showing how it moves, but he did an amazing job of modeling this in a way that it's flexible, that it's able to fold and unfold. And the bottom two images are renderings of his model. So those are not paper folds, those are computer models. Another master is David Huffman, who also came from a different field. He was a computer scientist, and then he became interested in origami and started writing about it and exploring these forms. And he also was looking at curved folds. And here you can see him holding one form and one of his other forms, which is very similar to some of the work that I was doing with Ron Resch, in fact. The one that he's holding is also very architectural. You can think of it as a column capital, for example. And there was an article in the New York Times in 2004. So this was after he died. He died in 1999. And one of the quotes that I just wanted to read is interesting. Most computational origamists are driven by sheer curiosity and the aesthetic pleasure of these structures, which is true. That's what led me to it. But then the work also finds applications in fields like astronomy and protein folding, right? Large scale, small scale, and even automobile safety. So if you consider an airbag, right, they also use origami. An airbag needs to be, when it's not in use, in a very compressed space. And then when it's needed, it has to expand. And there are origami techniques that allow that to happen. And another application where it's finding its way is in architecture. And I'll talk more about that, of course. Another master is Erik Demaine, who's also a physicist and mathematician and teaches at MIT. And this is one of his folds, which creates a hyperbolic paraboloid, or a hyper. And it's also a very simple, you can see the pattern, very simple diagram. And again, the solid lines fold in one direction and the dashed lines fold in the other direction. And it creates this form that's very flexible. And it's made of only straight lines, but the form itself is very curvy. And he combined them to create these polyhedral forms, these stellated polyhedra, and also explored curved geometry. And he's also written books about the mathematics and the science behind origami. So usually when we fold a form, the intention is to start with a flat sheet and then fold it to create a three-dimensional structure, like an insect or a polyhedron. But there's a form of origami where you take a flat sheet and you fold it and you end up with a flat sheet. But in the final product, some parts of the sheet actually overlap. And if you hold it up to light, you get these beautiful geometric patterns, geometric tessellations. And there are some artists who explored this feature of origami, and Alex Bateman is another. And he also created software to design some of the folds that create these forms, these structures. And other artists like Thomas Millett, there's a whole slew of them. And these are very intricate, right? Even if you're working on a large sheet, some of the folds are very intricate and tedious to build, right? And they take a very long time. Sometimes you need help. So for example, using binder clips. But then the results are well worth it. And Erik Gerdy created these, and the past few slides is very prolific. He's created so many forms. Jun Matani is a Japanese origamist who also explores curved folds. And he recently published a book, came out either this year or last year, that explores some of these. And he also in his book has patterns that are able to create these. When I was studying at Pratt, I was studying with Haresh Lalvani. He was actually my mentor, and I took many classes with him, and even after school continued to collaborate with him. And one project that we worked on together was a collaboration with Milgo Bufkin, who's a metal fabricator located in Brooklyn. And we were studying how to create curved bending, curved folds using metal, using sheet metal, right? That's what Milgo Bufkin does. They do a lot of work for architects. They also work with artists. Some of Haresh's contributions to the field of architecture include studying the geometric relationships between forms, right? That's probably what he's most well known for. But for this project, in addition to that, we studied the computation of curved folds in 3 dimensions and also unfolding them to create the 2-dimensional patterns that we use to cut these out of metal. And Milgo Bufkin has various techniques in working with metal, and depending on the thickness of the metal, we had different routines, different techniques to be able to bend them. So an example of some of Haresh's work showing a family of forms, right? So these forms are all, each one is different, but they're all part of the same family. And it's probably pretty obvious to see a relationship between them, right? And you can think of these as columns. And the extended family, and a variation of that family as well, where instead of straight bends, we have curves, and here they're flipped and mirrored on top of each other. And at Milgo Bufkin, which is a large shop, and they have many machines that are able to work metal, and some of them are more than 100 years old, if not the machines themselves, at least the technology, like this brake press. And it's able to take a sheet of metal and bend it using a straight fold. They also have more sophisticated equipment, like laser jet cutters and water jet cutters that we used in order to create some of the forms that were not able to be created with straight folds, like these. And initially, the project focused on these column-like forms, right? And although they do behave structurally, they were intended as column covers. So if they were placed in a building, there would still be a steel column inside of them, or concrete column, and these would sort of cover the column. But they also do behave structurally as well. And we were working with some engineers to actually determine how structural they can become. So can we eliminate the column that's inside of them? In some cases, we could. But if we're, say, designing a 100-story building, you know, maybe this wouldn't be enough, just a 16th-inch piece of sheet metal. Right? These are all computer models, and these show relationships between sets of models. So this is a family of 4. Each one is different, but pretty obvious to see the relationship between them. This is a family of many columns, also a computer model. And in this case, maybe it's not so obvious that there's a relationship between them. But these were created using a computer script. And in fact, the same script was used to create all of these, just by changing the parameters. Right? So a single tool, computational tool, is able to create a vast variety of forms. So again, these are computer models that were created with this script. The same script, or a variation of the script, was also able to unfold those forms. And this is a photograph of the factory shop showing some of the actual columns that were built. And most of these are about 12 feet tall. And the limitation is just the size of the metal that's available and the size of the machines that can cut them. The lower right image is not ours. That model is different. What is that called? A photobomb? When someone sneaks into a photo. But all the rest of them are. And in addition to these column enclosures, right, on the back wall, you can also see some panels. And those were also developed using the same technique, the same system. And we had an exhibit in 2004 at the Municipal Art Society that sort of highlighted these objects. And the columns here are the same ones that we saw in that computer model. These are about 12 inches tall. And at one point, Bruce Gitlin, who's the owner of Milgo Bufkin, was demonstrating how structurally performative these are. It's very thin metal. It's about a 1/16 of an inch, right? So you can take a sheet of metal that's not folded and actually bend it. But folding it, even with curved bends, gives them a lot of rigidity. So at one point, he took one of these and put it on the floor, and then with one foot stood on top of it. And it of course, didn't budge. In addition to these very regular forms, we also explored some more irregular forms. So these wall panels, for example.
Oh, his imaginary. Yeah.
These wall panels use the same system, but in a more flexible or free way, for example. And these are all images from the exhibit. So here you can see some of the panel structures that we created, wall panels and ceiling panels. And in addition to models, we also had drawings of some that we didn't actually build, and these are some of those. And MoMA was interested in some of the work that we were doing, and these are now part of the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art. This is an interesting form. It's a torus. We're actually inside of a torus, so you can see where this donut shape is spinning around towards the back. And it has an undulating surface with creases, so it's an origamic surface as well. And one thing that we were exploring is, with Haresh, instead of having a hard crease, like we usually see in origami, is it possible to have a soft crease? So the bend is actually not a hard line or a hard edge, but is much softer, is curved. So these are all different views of that same model. John Lobel, who also teaches at Pratt, wrote an article that was published in a journal, Architectural Design, AD magazine, where he described Haresh's philosophy about design and how forms can be placed in families and how they relate to each other, and then how that became useful in the design of these columns with Milgo. So these are part of that that paper that John Lobel wrote with Haresh Lalvani. And on the right, you see some columns that we looked at. And on the left, you see how one of the columns, the one on the left, can be thought of as not just a column or a column enclosure, but actually a building, like a skyscraper. So the horizontal lines could be considered floors, for example. And then you have these mega columns, which sort of branch as they go up. Or a smaller, maybe residential house, still using the same system, the same design technique. These are some of those wall panels, different variations of some of the more free-form structures, but still following the same rigid geometry. In fact, when you cut a curved fold, it needs to be very precise. You can't just cut any curve and be able to fold them, right? They're very geometrically computed. And some different views of, say, interior configurations using these walls. This is a different project, also with Haresh Lalvani, not part of the Milgo collaboration, but it's a roof structure and created with some number of these rhombus-like panels, and there's a limited set of them that repeat themselves. Another artist who also I was fortunate enough to collaborate with is Kenneth Snelson, who's famous for a technique called Tensegrity. And his structures are created with solid rods. You can see them on the left, for example, that are not touching each other. So the solid rods are suspended with cables. But it's still sturdy. It's still, well, they're flexible, but it's not going to fall down. It's a stable structure. And at one point during our collaboration, I visited Ken in his studio, and he had some origami models in his studio, like the red and green one that I'm showing at the right. And he was explaining to me how origami can be used to study tensegrity. And if we look at this origami model, if we look at these red pairs of triangles, where they bend, that's where the rods are. That's where the compression or the rigid members of the sculpture are located. And you can see that this rod between these two red triangles doesn't touch any other rod, right? The edges of the green triangles are the cables that connect them. So he can study any idea that he has about a tensegrity form and model it first using paper, and then look at the folds and then be able to build it, right? Analyze it and build it. And others have also written since then about the relationship between tensegrity and origami. Josef Albers, when I was doing research for the workshop in Illinois and also a couple above, a couple before that, I was very surprised, although I shouldn't have been, that Josef Albers was also very interested and teaching, in fact, at the Bauhaus, origami techniques to his students, and even using curved origami. So these are some examples of some of the work that he did there. And there's one image, the one in the middle on the right side, that reminded me of some of the textiles that Albers was doing. And then there are other origami forms that also seem to be related to images, which can easily be interpreted as textiles. Nancy Chang is a teacher at the University of Oregon. She's an architect as well. And she uses origami in her studios, in her architectural studios. And one thing that she focuses on is actually using Kirigami to create roof structures and ceilings that allow light to come into the space and to be able to control not only how much light is coming in, but how the light comes in to create these incredibly beautiful effects. So using it as a pedagogical tool. Projections. The Earth is spherical, but we often need to display it, to represent it on a flat surface. Okay? So there's a relationship there with origami. We want to take a three-dimensional form and be able to unfold it to a flat sheet so that we can recreate the three-dimensional form again. One problem with these projections is that they distort the geometry of the Earth. For example, in the Mercator projection, countries near the equator are fine, but countries near the poles are very distorted and appear on this map much larger than they actually are. So other types of projections try to resolve that problem, but they cause other problems. There's always a trade-off. If you fix one problem, usually you introduce another one with these types of projections. So Buckminster Fuller actually came up with his own projection of the spherical Earth onto a flat surface. And he uses geometry. He uses a particular polyhedron, in this case, called an icosahedron. And he calls this his Dymaxion projection. Today, by the way, is Bucky Fuller's birthday. So you can see in the top image how the net for the icosahedron, with the countries mapped onto the triangles, is folding to create the spherical Earth. And you can find these patterns on the internet, so you can build your own Dymaxion projection of the globe. So you can cut this out and fold it together. And he also looked at, in addition to the icosahedron, at other geometrical forms. So this is a cuboctahedron, right, with the countries mapped onto the squares and triangles of this cuboctahedron. So I wanted to talk a little bit about polyhedron, since we just mentioned them, and how they relate to origami. So there's a few types of polyhedron. The most general type, the most common type, are called platonic solids. And there's a rule with platonic solids in that each is only created using a single shape. It could either be triangles or squares or pentagons, right? The Archimedean solids are a variation of that rule that allows multiple shapes. So we can use hexagons and squares or squares and triangles, for example. And there are only 5 platonic solids, only 5 shapes that only use a single shape each. And there's a beautiful origamic proof for that fact. Why are there only 5? If we look at a triangle and we put a few of them together, right? We can't have 2, but if we put 3 triangles together, we can fold these around the point where they're connected to create a triangular pyramid, right? If we put 4 of them around a point, we can do the same thing. We can create a square pyramid. If we have 5 of them around a point, we can do the same thing, create a pentagonal pyramid. If we have 6 of them, we can't do that because 6 of them already fill the plane and there's no way to fold it up. It cannot become 3-dimensional. Similar for squares, we can have 3 squares around a point and they become the corner of a cube, but 4 squares doesn't work, it's flat. And we can also have 3 pentagons around a point and there's a slight gap that allows us to fold it to create a 3-dimensional form. And hexagons don't work either. So these nets, these 5 nets, allow us to create the 5 platonic solids. And we could look at the complete nets instead of just one corner. If we unfold the entire solid, these are the nets that we can create that will allow us to fold and create the complete solid. And here's an animation showing the icosahedral net made up of 20 triangles and how it's able to fold like Bucky Fuller's image animation to create the icosahedron. So I mentioned this workshop that I attended at the University of Illinois that was interdisciplinary. A couple of years before that, the National Science Foundation put out an announcement to invite proposals for a grant that focused on origami. And Professor Polino, who organized the conference at the University of Illinois, also put together a team to create a submission for this grant. Unfortunately, the team didn't win, but it was an incredible experience working on the application for the grant, actually. And the people sitting around this table, some of them we saw before. This is Robert Lang on the right side. Next to him is Tomo Hiratachi. Right? Simon Guest is another person that spoke at the lecture 2 years later at the conference. I'm sitting at the table as well. You can see my best side. Bill Baker and Dorothy Cox are on the screen. They weren't able to attend live. Alex Begini and Keith Besserud are 2 SOM people. This is Chuck Hoberman. We're going to see his work in a little while. He's also fascinating. And next to Professor Polino are 2 of his students, Evgeny and Lauren. And all of us participated in creating the proposal for this grant. A little bit about now origami and architecture, what you've all been waiting for. You know, if you do a web search, if you do a search on the internet for origami and architecture, you'll probably find images like this. And these are interesting, but not really what I'm going to focus on. One question you might ask is why use origami as an inspiration in architecture? And there are reasons for it. One of them is aesthetics, but another reason is structural. If you have a flat sheet of material, like a piece of paper, and you support it between 2, say, stacks of books, it doesn't have any strength at all. It's going to sag. And if you try to stand the paper, say, on one edge, you can't do that at all. But if you do simple things to the paper, like roll it up, then it is able to span those books without a problem. Or if you fold it, like create this corrugated fold, then it's able to span those 2 columns of books without a problem at all. When we think of origami in architecture, there are 2 facets, 2 ways we can think about it. One of them is using origami as an inspiration, right? So the buildings, if you look at them, sometimes very obviously, are inspired by origami. You can see bends, you can see curves, sometimes curved folds, but often straight folds. But the buildings don't actually move, right? They're inspired by origami, but they're traditionally constructed buildings. Another way to think of origami in architecture is actually to consider buildings that do move, either that fold in place as they become constructed. So you deliver a building on a truck, and then when it gets to the site, it's able to unfold to create the actual building, or buildings that have moving parts, even as they're in use. And those might be, say, in response to environmental conditions, right? Parts of the building open and close to let more daylight in, for example. Some examples of the first category, which are origami inspired. These buildings don't move. This is a stadium roof, also at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign by Max Abramovitz, who was an alumni at that school. So when I gave a presentation there, it was very appropriate to include him. Gaudi, who also, he's a Spanish architect. Most of his work is in Barcelona, in Spain. The 2 images on the right are of some of his chimneys, and on the left, some columns. You can see the fluting in the columns, so it's almost like a corrugation. His work, at first glance, might not appear very mathematically rigorous, but if you study it, and there are people who have extensively, the rigor, the mathematical rigor is extensive and amazing. And also, in some cases, influenced by origami. Whether intentionally or not, we're not sure. Some more contemporary structures, the Yokohama Cruise Terminal. And these buildings, cruise terminals and airports, have incredibly large spans. So the structural efficiency of bending material, like these architects and engineers are doing here, allows the ceilings to span, the ceilings and roofs to expand these great distances. In this case, it might be more Kirigami inspired because of the openings and letting light into the space. Cecil Baumann is an engineer that has collaborated with many architects to realize their forms. And many of these architects' forms have origami influences as well. Santiago Calatrava, another Spanish architect. In addition to buildings, he's also a sculptor. And you can see in many of his works, both sculptures and buildings, how they have characteristics of origami embedded in them. Now, we talked about some materials. We talked about paper. We talked about sheet metal. We looked at plywood. We talked about plywood. But brick is one material that would probably be a stretch to consider as a material that you can use to create structures and architecture that's origami-like or origami-inspired. But actually, if you have a brick wall that's corrugated, this is one example, right? And this is more structurally efficient, right, than a brick wall that would be straight, for example. And an architect that used this technique in a much more interesting way is Eladio Dieste. He's was a South American architect who used brick and other masonry structures, like this canopy, where he's able to fold, either with straight folds or in here, they're very undulating folds, create these walls that are much more structurally efficient than a flat wall. SOM has also done many buildings that have been inspired, again, knowingly or not, by origami and origami techniques and models. This is the 1963 Air Force Academy chapel in Colorado. And this was designed by Walter Netsch. This is a more recent project in 2015, the Beijing Tower. And in this case, the form of the building is a simple extrusion. It's a rectangular extrusion. But the facade is made up of these components that are very much origami influenced. And I worked on this project, so I can tell you for sure that there definitely was thought about the influence of origami in this project. Right, here's an elevation of it and a blow up. And one aspect where origami helped us, in addition to giving us the desired aesthetic effect that we were looking for, because of the way that these panels move in and out, there's some what we call self-shading. So some parts of the building shade other parts of the building. And there's a performance benefit in terms of heat gain inside the building in doing that. So it saves energy, in fact. And so this building doesn't move. It's a static building, just using origami as an influence. But because of the form of the building and because of the self-shading, as the sun moves, the shadows that the building creates on itself is constantly changing. And we were pretty excited about that aspect of the project as well. So it's a static building, it doesn't move, but it's also very dynamic. And these show some instances of the sun, and these images show many more. And the building's complete now. These are some photographs of when they just started constructing these panels and placing them on the tower. Another project was done in 2012 in Saudi Arabia for the King Abdullah Financial District. And it's a whole complex of buildings. And we designed the conference center. And one of the regulations, one of the rules that the government applied to the buildings that were being designed by several architects is that they must be faceted. Right? So using origami as an inspiration, as an influence was required. And one challenging aspect of doing forms like this, especially if they're not repeating forms, so the triangles in this roof don't repeat each other, is designing the joints. So we're able to use computational tools and analysis tools to help us design the joints and make sure that they would be effective and efficient in the structure. And even the interiors, we were able to use the same language or similar language the World Trade Center. Now, the form itself is pretty simple. It's what's geometrically called a square antiprism. So there's a square at the top and a square at the bottom, and they're rotated 45 degrees with respect to each other. And this is an easy form to create a net from a piece of paper and be able to fold into the shape. And one aspect when I was on the project team that I was focusing on is the spire of the World Trade Center. And that's also an origami form. And it's very much influenced by Yoshimura. We saw him earlier in the crust soda can, right? So this uses a very similar geometry to ones that he was exploring, except here, instead of being a simple straight extrusion, so all the triangles are the same, because the spire tapers, the triangles vary, they're all different. And we were talking to a couple of different manufacturers as we were designing this, because we wanted to make sure that it could be fabricated and brought to the site. So we were able to unfold it in different ways depending on the requirements for each one of those fabricators. Other origami influenced forms of SOM towers. I'll just go through these quickly. This one is a corrugated elliptical building. Here you can see the folding triangles. Now this building is interesting, and we've done many buildings like this. It has what's called a double skin. So the inner skin, which people on the inside actually can touch and are up against, is a flat wall. But then the second skin, the outer skin, is what undulates back and forth. And the space in between actually helps keep the building environmentally conditioned in a very economical way. Another example. This building also is very Yoshimori influenced. Here on a different scale than the spire. So when we talk about origami, and here in the next few slides, talking about buildings that actually move, two types. One is functional when flat. So when the structure is flat or unfolded, it performs the function that it was intended. And when it doesn't need to perform that function, it can be folded for storage. And I'm going to scroll through this quickly because I'm just looking at the time. So here's a stadium roof. So when it's not needed to cover the roof, it compresses to the middle of the stadium. Bridges as well, right? When the bridge is needed, it's unfolded. When it's not, it compresses. Another bridge. These shading panels in a building in Abu Dhabi, same thing. When they need to shade the building, they're unfolded. Here you can see the scale of those. Some very simple shading devices. You know, we saw some of the work of Calatrava before, and this is an early work by Calatrava, and one of my favorite. So it's a warehouse, and Calatrava designed these garage doors in such a way that they're made up of these slats. Each slat has a single bend, and there's no curve, right? The bends are flat, but each bend is in a slightly different location. So when the door is closed, right, you can see the smile made up of these straight lines. But when the door is open, it creates this beautiful three-dimensional form. Chuck Hoberman is an engineer who actually does moving buildings, right? His thesis, and he's written patents about how we can actually make buildings move, make components in buildings that are able to open and close. Structures that are folded to fit in a rocket for transport, and then when it gets into space, it unfolds, it flattens out. Or the opposite, buildings or structures, objects that are stored flat and then folded when they need to be functional, like this chair, right? When you don't need the chair, you fold it flat and store it. When you need the chair, it can fold together again. Or kayaks. That's become a popular thing, actually. One reason for studying origami, and this has yet to be explored, is actual construction. So usually when components like structural steel needs to be delivered to a site, the limitation is what we can fit on a truck. So here you can see columns for the Sears Tower in Chicago being transported to the site. And there were hundreds and hundreds of deliveries of these structures because what can fit on a truck is limited. If we're able to sort of fold the structural system And then when it gets to the site, be able to unfold it, we can probably be much more efficient in the delivery of these objects. Jean Nouvel in 1987 designed the Arab Institute in Paris. And this was one of the first examples of buildings with moving components. And these facade elements are able to open and close. And they had automatic sensors that looked to see if the sun was out and facing this wall and could close if necessary to protect the spaces behind them. One problem with this building is that the motors failed after a few years. So although it's still a beautiful building, it doesn't work as intended. And this probably is one reason why it's not done, this technique of having buildings with moving parts so much as we would like to, because there's a great chance of failure. But Chuck Hoberman is actually addressing that issue. And a lot of his work is trying to design techniques and systems and machine parts that will not fail. So these are some of his sculptures, and also some architectural pieces. One of his famous pieces, which you might not know was his, is for the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. He designed the stage that opens and closes. He designed these tents that are able to be delivered to a site, say in an emergency condition, using a very small volume so it can fit on a truck, and then opened up to create these huge tents when it gets to the site. Another example of his sculpture. Now here's another stadium enclosure, which is different from the one that we saw before, which compresses towards the middle, the Slag-Bergman structure. This one actually compresses towards the outer rim. And this is a patent that describes the joints that make his mechanisms possible. And it's actually very simple. Applications in furniture. Uh-oh.
I think we just lost Neil for a second. I hope we'll get him back in a minute. But I wanted to say also, you can also prepare some questions, because as soon as we have him back here, there will be also some time to ask Neil.
I have a question that maybe you know the answer to. I see this is recording.
Mm-hmm.
Will we be able to share that with people that weren't able to attend?
Yes, definitely. Yes. Perfect. So I will just put it up on the website as soon as, or by tomorrow it's going to be up on the website. And then, yes, I hope we can share it with the world. Yeah, let's hope that we have. There was such. It was just getting more and more interesting. I was so fascinated. I hope we can.
Cheers, Neil.
My computer just crashed. I'm so sorry. Maybe that's a good place to end.
I was just saying that also everybody can prepare maybe some questions, but yes, continue and finish up with whatever needs. I think that was so. I'm just so fascinated by all of this. So take your time.
Okay, it's rebooting.
Yeah, so we will then in the end just open it up for questions again, right? So everybody who.
I just had a handful of slides left. That was very close to the end.
No, but please let's continue, because okay. I want to see all of it. And okay. I think everybody else is also eager to see the rest. So, and again, this is going to be recorded, so we will have it by tomorrow. Okay.
Okay. Maybe you can edit the recording and move the remove this part.
Maybe do that. But all right.
I'm just joining again.
These difficulties are part of it.
Yes.
Should we save other questions till the end or fill in the time right now?
I think, Neil, right, it's probably easier to have it all in the end.
Yeah.
The time to actually. But if you already.
My computer's up. I'm just joining the meeting now. There we go. Are you able to see my screen?
Neil, I don't know. Maybe one of them will be. I should unmute one of them, or you can maybe do that.
I think I did.
One is the better one.
Is this better?
Yes. Yes. I think it's good.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. So origami and furniture, right? In addition to architecture, furniture designers have also used origami as an influence in their work, either influenced by it. So these furnitures don't move, right? They're static, but very much and obviously influenced by origami. And these furniture items do move. So these are able to open and close, right? So when you don't need the table, you can store it flat against the wall. When you need to use it, it's able to open up again. Or the simple stool, right, or table, folds into a book and is able to open up to create something that's useful. Origami in fashion. Clothing that's very much origami influenced, very directly. And one thing that's interesting here, the origami is flexible, especially when it's fabric. And this fabric is probably a little different from typical fabric. It's probably a little bit stiffer. So it's able to hold the form, but still very flexible. So as the body moves, it's able to accommodate. Issei Miyake is a Japanese fashion designer who explored using pleating and origami in his fashion designs very extensively. You know, I found this book by accident many years ago called The Art of Manipulating Fabric. And again, fabric is different from paper, and it's usually very much more flimsy. So it's hard to create a traditional origami form using a sheet of fabric because of that. But there are still so many things that you can do that are related to origami using fabric, how you can take a flat sheet of fabric material and be able to create these very beautiful and interesting and useful results. Origami in nature, right? Architects often look to nature for inspiration for their work, and we can find examples of origami there as well. So these leaves that are bending, shells that are corrugated. And you know, nature, and they're beautiful, right? You look at a rose, and it's a beautiful aspect of nature, but nature doesn't try to be beautiful. Everything in nature is for a reason, right? It's to benefit the object, the thing, the creature. So these folds are there for a reason, whether it's for stability for the leaf, whether it's to help collect water, right? It's for a very specific reason. Ernst Haeckel was a scientist in the late 1800s who did these incredible drawings of nature. And he was also probably, and obviously by looking at his drawings, also very interested in geometry. So he highlights many of the geometrical aspects of these natural creatures that he drew. Photography. Now this photograph by Bernice Abbott, maybe it should have been in the nature section, but it's a physics phenomenon where if you have two drops in a pool of water, they create waves, and the interference patterns of the waves. When I looked at this photograph, at first I said that's origami, right? Look at the forms, it's so beautiful. There's another aspect, canoptic art, using photography in a very specific, very special way, where if you have two photographs and you cut them into strips, and then you put them together by alternating them, and then you corrugate the strips. When you look at them from one direction, because of the corrugation, you see one set of facets and not the other, you can see one of the images. Then as you move around and look at it from the other side, you can see the other image. So using origami, you can call this sculptural, I guess, mixing of photography and sculpture and origami. And there's an artist, Yaakov Agam, who's an Israeli artist, that actually explores this quite extensively. And just recently, a paper was written using not just a simple corrugation, but using the Miura fold, which we talked about at the very beginning, to achieve a very similar effect. So the photograph is cut up into these diamond shapes and then put on alternating faces of this structure. When you look at it from one direction, you see one photograph, and the other, you see the other. Some computational tools that I worked on. I talked about one of my students creating this computational tool to do one of Ron Resch's folds. Of course, I had to do it too. And it's not so, well, nothing's easy. Even to fold it by hand is easy. But folding things by hand, there's a lot of intuition that you could use. And when you have to describe something like this to a computer to create a script or a program to be able to simulate, there are so many things that you need to consider that you just take for granted when you're doing it manually, when you're doing it by hand. Another example, this table being created. We saw this polyhedra. This is a platonic solid. It's a cube. And we saw that we can create a net of the cube, right? So the faces of the cube, they're square faces, and there are 6 of them. So we took a 3-dimensional form and was able to unfold it to create a 2-dimensional net. Suppose we look at a different dimension. Suppose we look at a 4-dimensional form. So this is a 4-dimensional version of a cube. It's called a hypercube or a tesseract. And what we're looking at are its shadows, because we can't actually see anything in 4 dimensions. And looking at my computer screen or your computer screen, it's actually 2-dimensional. So you're seeing a shadow of this 4-dimensional form. And in the bottom right, you're seeing a moving shadow. And we can unfold this 4-dimensional form to create a 3-dimensional origami, right? So instead of going from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions, we're going from 4 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And Salvador Dali, the surrealist artist, actually used this concept in one of his paintings. Right? So this is a 3-dimensional unfolded version of a 4-dimensional cube on a 2-dimensional canvas. Suppose we go in the other direction. So instead of going from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions, suppose we go from 2 dimensions to 1 dimension. So if we have a square, for example, a simple 2-dimensional shape, we can unfold that square to create a line. Or we can take a line and then fold it up to create a bent line. So I've been exploring this very simple technique, right? Very simple idea for so many years, and still exploring. And the variations are actually endless, right? So this is taking the edge of a polygon and just bending it. And in this case, just one bend, and also looked at instances where there are 3 or 4 bends, for example, to create these new polygons. And one interesting thing about polygons is that we can put them together to create lattices. So on the left side, we have triangles that we can put together to create a triangular lattice. And then when we bend the edges of each one of the triangles, we get these new forms, right? They transform. And in all these cases, we're starting with the same lattice. And because we're doing something different in how we're bending the edges, coming up with different shapes, different forms. And here looking at a lattice composed of triangles and hexagons. And again, the variations are quite extensive. And working on papers and exploring this technique, both physically, like drawing by hand and exploring different variations, developing computer tools to create some of these different models. And this is 24 pages of probably about a 60-page paper that I've written and haven't submitted yet because I'm still working on it. These are some origami structures that I've created. So at the very beginning, we talked about using origami paper or using different materials like regular paper. These were created using Post-it notes. So these actually are quite small. So this is using a regular 3-inch square Post-it note. Right? These are the same forms, back and front, different form, front and back. And you know, to explore variations, these become useful tools because even with something as simple as a Post-it note, you can create these and study them and look at variations. It also becomes very what's the word I'm looking for? Often when I'm on a conference call and need something to do with my hands, I'll often create one of these. And these take hours. Each one of these maybe takes 4 or 5 hours to create. And here you can see the scale. And just to end on some, and if this is going to be recorded, these will be available, some resources, some books that have been written about some of the people, websites, some of the people that we talked about, some of the techniques that I described. Both dealing with origami and just general mathematical topics that relate to it. And that's it.
Thank you
Now
so
I guess
much.
I can take questions. I'm sorry I took so long and sorry for that mishap in the middle, but we did get through it. And I was very happy to share some of the stuff at the end because I think it's interesting.
Not at all too long. I think it was extremely fascinating and I could have listened much longer. But I think it would be great if anybody has any questions to ask them now. You can also just put them in the chat and I'm just gonna unmute you, or you just unmute yourself. I think it's a good group that everybody could just unmute themselves and ask if ready. I have the feeling there wasn't there a question by Matt before? Matt, didn't you have a question?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I had to find the unmute button.
Sorry.
So hi, Neil. Yeah, Matt Josef. Yeah, we've known each other long time. So so Neil's one of my idols. He's pretty awesome. But yeah, I guess one of the larger questions, or I guess it's twofold, is how do we, as an industry in AEC, promote, and also in academia, I guess, promote the next generation of people to start researching this? I mean, I think, you know, guys like Erik Demaine are a good example of that at MIT. I'm sure he has acolytes and sort of researchers that are doing stuff, but like, this doesn't seem, there's a body of work that's been around for a long time that hasn't seemed to have made it into like the sort of larger design community or engineering community as much as it really could. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with you. I think it is, and I think it's one of many topics that could very well be explored by students and professionals alike to to study, to create interesting design ideas, and not only actual designs, but ways of thinking about design. And I think maybe lectures like this are one way to promote it. Schools are another way. You know, one thing that I always encourage when I teach my students is just to be curious, to look at anything that you find even an inkling of interest in and explore it. And often, you know, it could be something that you don't think of as having some value in the design process. And maybe origami is one of those, but to think again. And I think, you know, you're right, there has been so much work, and I've shown some of it, just the tip of the iceberg of research that's been done in this particular area. And each one of these, I mean, so many different aspects, like the relationship between tensegrity and origami, there are tons of papers written about that, right? So it is really an explosive field. There's so much information. It just requires people to think there's a use for it. And I think that's what we need to encourage.
There is a lot of comments about thanking you. Everybody seems to have loved it. I just have a question on, you mentioned that you have a work of art in the background, the virtual background.
Yes.
Who is the artist, or who is the artist?
Josef Albers actually is the artist.
Ah.
Hi, this is Monica Becker from Chicago. Hi, Neil. It's a pleasure to see you. I have a comment and then a question. The first comment is to just, the talk was making me nostalgic for when Neil was in Chicago. And we weekly played chamber music together. And after one chamber music session, Neil sat at my dining room table and taught me how to fold origami Post-it notes, which was a very happy thing. So, okay, my question, this is probably impossible to answer, but during what might be a multi-year pandemic, how do we think that a world crisis like this may influence the development of this sort of creative tool for commercial, educational art applications?
Well, you know, one thing that we've been considering for a long time as architects is how to make buildings respond to the environment, and a huge focus on sustainability and saving energy. And origami is one technique that gives us some tools to be able to do that. And you know, I'm wondering, I don't know the answer, you're right, it is a hard question, but I'm wondering if there are similar ways of thinking about architecture, and maybe origami can be part of that, to respond to the pandemic, to respond to, you know, future ways of how buildings will need to be designed and even existing buildings used. Maybe using origami to create dividers between people and their desks, so that there's some protection, you know, protection there. There are probably many, maybe even infinite things that we can think about and consider. And you know, maybe that's something I should focus on. That's a great question.
There is actually another one that actually also mentions the craziness of the current events and how that is such a, was so reassuring because it was so rational, and you know, I agree with that completely. It's from Zach Krohn. Do you want to say anything?
Oh, sure. Just Neil, it's great to sort of see this much fantastic work all sort of in one place. My son, who's 16, is also sitting here watching the show, and it's just and I'm also sort of on a side chat with Lyra and Matt about how we're finding this very calming in the midst of so much craziness right now. Just to sort of see that there are, you know, underlying principles and underlying ideas that sort of, you know, are persistent across long spans of time and that are still incredibly relevant today. So thank you. It's a good way to start a Sunday.
Thank you.
Is there any more questions or comments? Feel free to say what's on your mind. But otherwise, I also just think that was an amazing and great way to start a Sunday, and I'm really very thankful that you agreed to.
Of course, thank you. I appreciate it. I enjoyed preparing this and giving the presentation as well. And so great to see many friends who I haven't seen in a very long time.
So I think I'm gonna actually, I will thank you again, and I will just end it right here. But I will put the recording up online, and please share it with everyone. And I also have some parts in the chat here about sharing it with some people, so I will do that. But thank you, everyone, and yeah, for being here, and come back. We have actually the Church of Monica. Maybe one more comment about that. It's every second Sunday, every month. Most of the time, we're a little bit loose in the last few months here, but in general, it's every second month, every second Sunday of the month. And we will try to actually keep that a virtual event and in person in the future. So if you're not yet part of our mailing list, sign up for that. The Church of Monica obviously is not religious. It's only about art and community. And yeah, there's also a lot of other things that we do. Thanks again, and have a great Sunday, everyone. And thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nia.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.